I think I've started recording. It's hard for me to know. Ah, yes. Okay. Okay. All right. We're ready to go. Well, we can pick up where we left off. We got to the church at Pergamum last time that we were talking, and it was a kind of rush. So I wanted to back up a little bit and work from there. But as you remember, John is writing his letters to the seven churches of the book of Revelation that we know of, beginning at Ephesus and then moving northward, and then they'll come back down southward. And prior to this time, John has had this vision of Christ, a rather elaborate vision with seven candlesticks or seven lights around him, holding seven stars, a sword coming from his mouth, a sword of judgment, his eyes a fiery red. And each aspect of this vision is going to have a relevance to one of these churches. So let me just read beginning at chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. This is, we talked about this last time, but I'll just get a running start where we're going, just pick up where we left off. And to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, these are the words of him who has the sharp two-edged sword. I know where you are living, where Satan's throne is. Yet you are holding fast to my name, and you did not deny your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you, where Satan lives. Two references to Satan in a couple of verses, right? But I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold to the teachings of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the people of Israel, so that they would eat food sacrificed to idols and practice fornication. So you also have some who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Repent then. If not, I will come to you soon and make war against them with the sword of my mouth. Let anyone who has an ear to listen. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. To everyone who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give a white stone, and on the white stone is written a new name that no one knows except the one who receives it. A lot of important imagery there, and I'd like to talk about them one by one. But first of all, the reference to Satan's throne. I showed you this image last time. This is a model of the temple to Zeus, the high god among the Greeks, who was also worshipped in the Roman form among the Romans. This model is actually, I should say, the temple that once stood in Pergamum is now on display, what's left of it, in a museum in Berlin. I think it's the Berlin Museum. And I think I mentioned last time that you can get online and take a tour of this, the remains of these, of this temple. But around the temple itself, and this next image, you have, if you could go back here, you can see down along the edge, you have all of this art that reenacts the battle of Zeus with the Titans. And this is Greek mythology going all the way back to Hesiod in the 8th century. But it is a story of creation, really. Not even a creation of the world, but a creation account that happens before the time of the creation of the world. Is the time of the gods. And you may remember the story that there are two levels of gods. There are the high gods, among whom a group known as the Titans are the warriors, and then Zeus and his brothers and sisters, who are kind of second level gods, but they engage in a battle, and Zeus overwhelms the high gods, and he chains them into the earth itself. And from this day forward, it's understood that the Titans are bound underneath the earth in some, cavernous stronghold. The reason I bring this up is because, in our previous study, we were talking about the idea of the evolution of hell, of, a place where punishment prevails to those who don't follow the law and the covenant with God. But this most likely, Hesiod's theogony, most likely had a influence on the Judeo-Christian development of the idea of hell. Now, the stories and the heroic tales of that battle are all carved beautifully along, the bottom of this temple area. And this is, I can't identify this exactly. I see what looks like a serpent figure there, but I don't know the theogony well enough to know what that would be about. But at the center of Pergamum, there was not just the temple to Zeus, but there was the narrative in full display. And so this is a city where, Greco-Roman values, religion, a loyalty to the gods that was followed by different trade groups, and also the imperial cult would have been, highly prominent. And so John wastes no time in identifying this with Satan twice in the first couple of verses that we saw. So any comments about that? I want to try to give you more time to jump in. I feel like I talk too much sometimes. So any comments or questions about that so far? Looking down the line. Okay. Well, one thing I've been impressed with, and when you read the Bible at different times in your life, different things present themselves to you. But one thing that I've been so impressed with in this, and I'm going to bring this out in as we move along, in his letters to the churches, John assumes a pretty intimate understanding of the Pentateuch and the prophets, what we would call the law and the prophets. His references are sometimes blatant, one-for-one correspondences, translations or quotations of the Old Testament. But more typically, he is giving metaphorical references to what's happening in the church in Pergamum and comparing it to what he knows has happened in the history of the Israelites. And one of these events, you probably know about Balaam. In fact, I won't read it. It's from Numbers. I'll just kind of try to summarize it here. But Balaam was a, kind of a wizard figure, a mystical type of person who worked for who was part of the Moabites. And there was a king by the name of Balak, and the king saw how powerful the Israelites, who were wandering still in this time in the desert, they were faithful to God and faithful to God's covenant. And Balak felt that the Israelites were going to become too powerful, and so he devised a method. Can you imagine this? Politicians devising a method to overthrow their opponents. It just doesn't happen these days anymore, does it? He devises this method whereby Balaam encourages the men of Israel to worship the gods of the Moabites. And along with this, and this is something that I want to point out as well, that idolatry, worship of other gods, and sexual immorality almost go hand in hand. And this is important for us to remember. I know. But it's important for us to remember in our Puritan culture, because we think of sexual immorality as a standalone sin against God. But throughout the Old Testament, and even into the New Testament, if we think about, context in which Paul is writing, that sexual immorality is always coupled with idolatry. And so when you think about the, let's just use the condemnation of, there's only one verse in the Bible that condemns lesbianism, right? Women sleeping, or women, laying with women. And that's in Romans chapter 1, I think it's verse 19. But if you read that whole, pericope, as it's called, that whole section, you will see that Paul's real concern isn't with the sexual immorality. It's with what causes that, and that's the idolatry. Not listening to the God of Israel, but listening to these or falling victim to these foreign gods. And an outcome of that is a kind of a confusion about the order of the universe. These two things always go hand in hand. And so this comes up again and again. And when we, in the next church we look at, we're going to see a reference to Jezebel. And Jezebel is one who draws the Christians away from their true worship of God and in Christ, and encourages them to worship other gods. And attendant to that is sexual immorality that goes along with it. Now, I've heard some titters along the way. Does somebody wanted to say something about this, or this is the perfect place for Jane Marsh to make a joke?
Okay. Well, Dwight wanted to know how he can sign up for that religion. He thought that sounded good.
And at the core is this sense of, these are mystery religions, and the concern of people, of course, in agricultural and even, pastoral societies, is for productivity, is for assurance of a good crop the next year. And so you try to appease the god or goddess who is going to make that possible. The best example that I can think of is in the Old Testament is that of the Canaanite deities, Baal and Asherah, who had temples to their. I'm getting an interesting message. You're probably seeing that as well. I don't know what this is about. Who had temples that were erected, and part of that temple worship involved what we would call temple prostitution, sleeping with representatives of Asherah in order to assure fertility. I'm probably spending a little bit too much time on this, but we are going to hear about sexual immorality, but as we talk about this in the next chapter, think about how it's associated with idolatry. We're also going to talk about idolatry here. Back to Balaam. Balaam was one who tried to encourage the Israelites in the Old Testament to worship other gods, and thus to undermine the strength of the Israelite people. John is making the point that there are some among them in the church that are doing the same thing. They're trying to undermine the church by drawing them away from the worship of the true God to worship the gods that are all around them, as we see evidenced in this temple to Zeus. And so one of the problems is this idea of the Nicolaitans. And I'm going to have to remember the direction I'm going here. This really demonstrates the Jewish nature of John. The Nicolaitans apparently are those who feel that eating meat that has been sacrificed to idols is okay, not a problem, John, in writing to these churches, wants to argue the complete opposite. Now, this is important for us to remember because, if you're living in this society, the times when you would get meat, it wasn't like a common staple as it is for us Americans these days, but it would usually be associated with some sort of festival or, tribute to one of the gods. Sacrifice would be made. A certain portion of it would go to the priests. The rest of it would be distributed to the adherents of whatever religious group that we're talking about. Sometimes it would be sold in the markets, but if it was sold or if you came in contact with it at all, meat, most likely, 9 times out of 10, it would have been associated with some sort of sacrifice to one of the Greco-Roman gods, of which there were many. The 3 that we're looking at right now, Zeus, Artemis, and Apollo. We might call those the Greek Trinity, really. But John is saying, don't eat this stuff. This is only going to draw you away from worship of God, and it implies in some way that you are part and parcel of this, this loyalty that you're showing to these foreign gods. Don't fall victim to Balaam, who's trying to we don't know who this Balaam character was, but apparently there's a Balaam or a Jezebel in each of these churches trying to get them to accommodate, right? To accommodate to the society around them. And if you read all the letters that John writes to these churches, accommodation is the problem. Which raises a really interesting question. And Mac, I think you brought this up maybe a month ago. But this problem has already been solved by Paul some 45 years earlier. If you read the book of, well, I'll you know, in tribute to our presidential race today, 1 Corinthians, if you read 1 or 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians walk into a bar, that kind of thing. In 1 Corinthians, Paul addresses this issue, and I thought I'd read it to you. I've just put a snippet of it up here. Give me a minute to find 1 Corinthians. I should have set this apart. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Let's see what Paul has to say about it, and then ask the question, why is John so adamant about this? Now remember, Paul is writing to the Corinthians probably around the middle of, well, around 55 to 58 of the Common Era. And naturally, the page I need to read is stuck together. Here we go. And the Corinthians have written to Paul saying, hey, we're having these problems. Can you answer these questions for us? You know, there's dissension in the church. Some people are following others. Some people aren't clear on, you know, what rules need to be followed in order to maintain, you know, covenant purity, we might call it. And one of those is this Nicolaitan issue, people eating meat sacrificed to idols. So here's what Paul says. Now, concerning food sacrificed to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Anyone who claims to know something does not yet have the necessary knowledge, but anyone who loves God is known by him. Paul is playing on, you know, this idea of gnosis here in a way that can't detain us, but it kind of makes me wonder a little bit. I have to come back to that and think about it. Hence, as to eating of food offered to idols, we know that no idol in the world really exists, and that there is no God but one. Indeed, even though there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as in fact there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. It is not everyone, however, who has this knowledge. Since some have become so accustomed to idols until now, they still think of the food they eat as food offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Food will not bring us close to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if others see you, who possess knowledge, eating in the temple of an idol, might they not, since their conscience is weak, might they not be encouraged to the point of eating food sacrificed to idols? So by your knowledge, those weak believers for whom Christ died are destroyed. But when you thus sin against members of your family and wound their conscience, when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, and here's the conclusion of this very convoluted argument, if food is a cause for their failing, I will never eat meat, so that I may not cause one of them to fall. So what do you make of this? I mean, Paul is never entirely clear, you know, he never comes across as completely lucid on these things. But the upshot of it is these idols are just simply wood and stone and, you know, gold or whatever. And there is no true God behind them that is being worshiped. So if there is no God behind these idols, because there's only one God, one true God, then why would we think that food offered to a non-God would be defiled? No problem. Eat the meat. However, there are some in your church who are really pretty weak-minded still. You know, there are new Christians and they want to be as fervent in the faith as possible, and they haven't worked through this idea of eating meat that's been sacrificed to idols. If you, who have knowledge and are aware of the reality of the situation, if you go out and eat meat and they see you doing it, it may cause them to falter in their faith. So the real issue is, don't upset the faith of those who are growing in the faith by your need or your desire to eat meat. It's not that it's against the law. It's not that it has actually been truly sacrificed to a God, but it is what it might do to weaker Christians in the community. That's a pretty convoluted argument. But the long and the short of it is, this meat sacrifice to idols thing is a non-issue. So Mac, you brought this up earlier, so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this.
Well, Elaine Pagels has better thoughts on this than I do. And she points out that it's kind of counterintuitive that Paul, as you pointed out, 2 generations really before John of Patmos, he has more of a vision as to what the church is eventually going to be.
Right.
Now, they're both followers of Jesus, but she says, you know, nobody, and I think Kester says this too, you know, the term Christianity wasn't used by either one of them. They didn't refer to themselves.
No.
But Paul had a vision that included Gentiles as Gentiles.
Right.
And that they could identify with the Jewish traditions, but he knew they were going to be Gentiles. John is way more reactionary. He is a Jew. He also believes in Jesus, but he sees Jesus just as a Jew who has identified with the new Messiah.
Jewish Messiah, absolutely.
You still have to be an Orthodox Jew. You still have to follow all of that stuff, but you just have to recognize who's the Messiah. And so in that sense, he's more of a fundamentalist Jew than Paul ever was, even though he was after him. And she, you know, thinks that some of this is kind of an implied criticism of Paul. When he goes down in the letter to Philadelphia and he talks about making those of the synagogue of Satan. The synagogue implies it's a Jewish synagogue. Right. But you've got those satanic, non-Jewish influences in there, and it could, you know, you could make Paul responsible for that if you wanted to.
Yeah, interesting. Right. I think it's important to point out that even, well, this would be 70 years after the death of Jesus. Paul would have been writing closer to 20 years after the death of Jesus, 20 to 30 years. But there is no one true church yet. They are still wrangling it out in terms of whether or not they're Jews or if there's something new, you know, something non-Jew. The Jews are helping them out by saying, you're not Jews, get out of our synagogue. This creates a problem because the Jews have certain protections under the Romans, right? They can worship their God. They do not have to worship the Greco-Roman gods, or the imperial, take part in the imperial cult. So this differentiation from the synagogue really puts Christians, as we will call them now, in a very precarious situation. They do not want to be part of that imperial cult. And one of the ways they can separate themselves from it is by not eating meat. However, this will only put the bullseye on their head if they don't do that. But John is absolutely convinced that Christ will return soon. And remember that the sword of his mouth will bring judgment. There's going to be some, sticking firm to your Jewish principles. There's going to be some tribulation. There's going to be some, martyrdom, as we've seen with Antipas, one of my faithful martyrs, as it says in the text. But it's going to be over soon, so suffer through it. Let me just remind you, let me see if there's anybody else. I always do this. Anybody else want to make a point on this?
I might make one.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Anyway, the one, we are one in the spirit and all that, leading back to, you are now one with the person you're disagreeing with. And so the relativism of it's more important to preserve the unity of the body of Christ, which we are the resurrection of. Of course, these are all ideas from 300 years later.
Right.
But anyway, that seems to me to be implied in this equivocations. This is probably one of the passages, because he equivocates in this way. That's probably one of the passages that they had in their hands 300 years later and are interpreting it that way.
Yeah.
Hey, I have something absolutely inane to say.
Oh, no.
Okay. A modern equivalent of the eating meat and having, and leading somebody astray. When I go for my walk in the morning, I always wear a mask, because I don't need one, but I do not want to be mistaken for an anti-masker. So
Yeah.
That's why that is my equivalent of not eating the meat.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we can think of other equivalents. There is a lot, and in fact, I wanted to talk a little bit about idolatry. There's a lot that draws us toward an idolatrous relationship with certain, political organizations, or our relationships with the material world. In fact, I was going to talk about idolatry, and this might be the place to do it. In terms of a modern application, St. Augustine refers to idolatry as disordered love of self. I like that, a disordered love of self. Now, what it means is, first of all, there's an ordered love of self that is appropriate, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. We, as Reformed Christians, particularly Presbyterians, have often been taught not to love ourselves too much, always to, carry around this burden of guilt. But there is an appropriate and a healthy love of self. What happens is when that disordered love of self becomes what I would call a love of ego. So there's love of self, which is, the image of God within you. And then there's love of ego. Ego, the Greek word for I, this idea that I am somebody apart from and unconnected with and undependent on, not codependent on, a community, the land in which I live, upon God. And so all that's left is this ego. And we see this so much today, this kind of idolatry. People aren't going around worshiping false gods, or if they, I mean, some people think that, well, Muslims are worshiping false gods. That's not really the issue. The real false god that's being worshipped in our culture today is the self. It's what perpetuates our economy. In fact, our economy depends upon the expenditures that we put out in order to appease our never-ending desires, right? Advertising, marketing is completely geared for you to focus on your ego, right? And I think one of the things the church needs to do is to emphasize the difference between this ego, which, there's a lot of it around, and the self. The self is something that's part of if we're created in the image of God, that there's something that's Trinitarian about our image as well, that we are not standalone, independent individuals, but we are related to God, we're related to our neighbor, and we're related to the community, and I would include in that the ecological community of which we are a part. And there's a balancing that takes place in that relationship. It gets disordered when it becomes, Augustine called it a disordered love of self. I would call it a disordered love of ego. So Jane, that's I skipped ahead a little bit, but I really think there's something that's quite relevant here, because this is what John is dealing with in some of these churches as well. Part of the accommodation that he's trying to prevent is rather ego-oriented in this Greco-Roman society. Would anybody like to say anything, make a comment, or ask a question at this point?
Yeah, Dan, I'm not sure exactly how this fits in. Thinking about non-issues that churches can get caught up in. Yeah. I remember maybe 25 years ago, some religious group had put up billboards between Hastings and Grand Island about how people had better be celebrating the Sabbath on Saturday, or we were really going to get it. And actually, thinking of the United States right now, I mean, maybe they were right. But I mean, there's somehow the love of an idea and giving it more prominence than it deserves, and there's a kind of egotism there, I think.
Absolutely.
But when I was seeing those billboards, I thought, gee, all the things that Jesus is concerned about, and we're going to worry about that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and then it brings up another point. One of the other things that we tend to idolize, and I know this may sound confusing to some people, it's this thing right here. We can turn the Bible into an idol.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Interpreting the Bible as God's word is different than affirming or trying to announce or trying to affirm that this is God's literal word. And so it comes to the point where we almost end up worshiping the Bible instead of seeing it as a means to understand God's word through the narrative of God's liberating acts in history as witnessed to by the Bible. This, and I often will tell my fundamentalist students, show me the word of God. And they'll say, here it is right here. And I say, no, Jesus is the word. In the beginning was the word was with God, the word was God. This is the finger that points to the word. As soon as you cut that finger off and make it the word itself, you've committed a kind of idolatry. And mix that up with a nationalism, and you've got a very volatile idolatry as well. Any comments about that? Will, you want to say something?
Well, I have another question when it's the right time.
Go ahead, please.
Well, so a lot of the emphasis of the letters was don't go along with local customs.
Right.
Now, wouldn't that lead to some pretty severe persecutions then, and
absolutely
being out of the community?
Yeah, and we've just read it in the letter to Pergamum. You know, there was a person, Antipas, my faithful witness, says Christ through through John, and the word is martyr, meaning witness, but that word is later going to be used to those people who, because of their opposition to accommodation, will pay the ultimate price. And so, and as Mac is pointing out, back to Paul and back to this contention between Paul and John. John is a hardcore Jewish, let's call him a Jewish Christian. That's an anachronistic word, but he is a person who believes that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah and that he has come to establish a new kingdom, and that kingdom will soon be established on earth. Jesus has not come to set aside any Jewish rules or covenantal responsibilities. In fact, Jesus has come to make them all the more binding, especially those that involve righteousness and justice, right? Paul, on the other hand, takes it a little bit further. Paul is probably the one, if we can say it this way, is the founder of Christianity. Christianity that can be very much distinguished from Judaism. It's not clear to me, as I see John writing to these churches, that the Romans would be able to distinguish them from Jews at this point. When Paul writes to the people in Corinth, now here I drew up this map because here's where we're talking about 7 churches of Asia. But when you get over here to Macedonia and present-day Greece, Paul was establishing churches there as well. Now, I am not enough of a geographer to know what kind of cultural differences may have, been present between these two regions. But Corinth, I know, is definitely a city in which there is a lot. It's a port city. There's a lot of diversity of cultures, diversity of languages, and Paul is being a little bit more accommodating to those people. He is going to say, Gentiles, you don't have to become Jews in order to become part of the church. And this becomes an issue, I guess, in Galatians, actually, because people were asking the logical question, okay, if I'm a Gentile and I want to join the church, then if I'm a male, do I need to become circumcised in order to become a Jewish follower of Jesus that will later be called Christians? And Paul says, absolutely not. I wonder what John of Patmos would say about that. Anybody want to chime in on that one? Because John is very Jewish oriented in this.
My understanding of the Greek commercial culture was that by the time the Romans kind of overthrew it and became dominant over it, was spread through all this area. Mm-hmm. That almost everywhere they used Greek as the trade language, even right. During the Romans period. That so that I've sort of assumed almost all these cities were had a lot of Hellenic background to them, and the fact that they all have temples to such and such Greek gods kind of backs that up as though the Greeks are really everywhere at this point.
Yeah, but the mystery still remains, and this is one that Mac brought up. It seems that Paul, 2 generations before John is writing, seems to have already addressed this issue and kind of moved on to something else, and John still thinks it's a real problem, and apparently it's still a real problem among 7 churches in Asia Minor.
Let me
go ahead, Mac.
Very briefly, because I don't want to talk too much either, but let me forward the possible thing to think about is maybe one of the reasons Paul thought about that was he was familiar with the traditions of the synoptic gospels, in which Jesus is certainly not depicted, as, if anything, as a stickler for the law.
Right, right.
And so that may have something to do with it. And that's why I think John's fundamentalism, as I would refer to it, is really kind of a conflicting thing.
Jewish fundamentalism. But, at this point, I should probably make a plug for my Sunday school class for the next 3 weeks in Forum. We're going to be looking at the Gospel of Matthew. And it's one of the synoptic Gospels that Mac is talking about. But when scholars look at Matthew, they see at least 3 distinct narrative communities that make up that text. One of those is a very Jewish community that's similar to what we're seeing here with John. So in the Forum, we'll probably take a look at the Jewish Matthew because you can find the way the synoptic gospels are written, you can find pretty much 80% of them as common among all of the gospels. But there are some narratives in which which only appear once in one of the gospels, right? Luke has some that are exclusive. Matthew has some that are exclusive. Even Mark has some that are exclusive that were taken out by Matthew and Luke. And if you isolate those narratives, you get a clear sense of what the communities to which these narratives were written, what they were like. It's no coincidence that Matthew has a very Jewish Christian community in which John of Patmos would have felt more than comfortable. Luke, on the other hand, has a very Gentile Christian community in which John would have felt like really a fish out of water. That's just my hypothesizing there. So Mac, what you're saying is true. Yeah, Paul may be the synoptic tradition.
And this is Al.
Go ahead, Al.
One aspect I was thinking of is the geographical aspect. Paul was more of a world traveler, went throughout the known world.
Right.
John was mainly emphasizing Asia and Asia Minor, which probably had a more Jewish population than the rest of the world that Paul was interested in.
Right, right. Yeah, there are a lot of dynamics going on here, but and maybe we're spending a little too much time on the question, but if I could summarize what we're trying to emphasize here, and it is the idea that, from the very beginning, there are many trajectories of faith in Jesus. One of those, there's a spectrum. One is very Jewish. Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. People, maybe Jesus has come to invite Gentiles into the Jewish community, and that's how they can be saved. But in order for that to happen, they have to follow the Jewish rules. The other side of the spectrum is that Jesus has come and has set aside, if you will, that's maybe a little too strong, but has de-emphasized the covenant responsibilities and has established a new covenant responsibility, which Paul summarizes in the word love in 1 Corinthians. And so we're seeing two ends of the spectrum there. Any other comments before we? And here I thought we'd get finished with the 7 churches today, and we haven't even got past Pergamum. My goodness. Talking too much, apparently. Well, there is one church called Thyatira, and I always have to wonder if I'm saying these correctly, but let me find Revelation once again so I can read that. John is writing to them, and again we have the same kind of outline. John is going to make a reference to the original vision. He's going to affirm that Jesus knows something about this church. He is going to emphasize what they're doing well, but he's also going to point out, here's some places where you can make some improvements. And then at the end, he is going to offer access to an eschatological community. Just let me remind you of what we talked about, because we kind of skipped over it for Pergamum. But for those who remain faithful to Christ, well, I'll read it. I'll read it here. Those who remain faithful to Christ, let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. To everyone who conquers, this conquering is very important, I will give some of the hidden manna, another Jewish image, and I will give a white stone. Interesting, a Greco-Roman image there I'll talk about. And on the white stone is written a new name that no one knows except the one who receives it. This is a reference to what many Jewish messianists thought about. For example, the Essene community, that in the coming days of the Messiah, there would be an eschatological meal, a banquet, where a new hidden manna, a new manna would be served. Just as there was manna that fell from heaven during the time of the Exodus, a new manna would be at the center of this eschatological meal. This white stone is a Greco-Roman practice. It's very interesting that you would give someone a white stone and say, hey, we're having a banquet at my house on Thursday, the 25th. Take this stone, give it to the attendant, and that's your invitation, right? We don't know if that was practiced among Jews, most likely, probably. But this white stone now is the ticket, you might say, the price of admission to this new eschatological meal. And on that stone is written a new name. In the coming era, our names who define who we are. Now, we don't do names the way most people did in the ancient Near East and in the Roman world. A name had power. If you knew someone's name, you knew something of their strength. And it's why many times in the Old Testament, you see people like Abraham not wanting to give his name, and God will give Abraham a new name, right? A new spiritual name. He used to be Abram. Now he is Abraham, because he's gone through some transformation after his meeting with God. The same will take place in this eschatological time. By the way, the term eschatological means in the end times, the last times. So John always concludes his letters with this hopeful affirmation of the world that is yet to come, but is soon to come, a new Jerusalem. And the rest of the book is going to be what happens in the meantime before that new Jerusalem gets established. So I think we're only going to have time to read the text of the letter to Thyatira. I'm going to read chapter 2, verses 18 through 29. To the angel of the church in Thyatira write, these are the words of the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. Let me just stop right there because I want to mention this. Thyatira was a city that was known for its trade guilds, kind of a manufacturing city. Craftsmen would form guilds, and which helped them in their business. And usually these guilds were associated with some sort of god. So sometimes these trade guilds would get together and they would have their, it's almost like a convention, right? When you have the dentists, they're all going to Vegas and they're going to learn about the new, the new software they can use or whatever. Well, the trade guilds did the same thing, but much more frequently than every year. They would get together, they would demonstrate their loyalty by burning incense and sacrificing meat to idols, to their gods. And then they would participate in what we might call a bacchanalia, a drunken festival in honor of their god. At the center of this city of Thyatira, though, was a temple to the god Apollo. Now, by the Roman era, Apollo had become the sun god. He was the one that moved the sun across the sky. But for the Greeks, Apollo, who was, as pictured here, the twin brother of Artemis, he's holding a lyre. He was the god of music, the god of poetry, the god of all good, refined human qualities. And so it was this god who was the son of Zeus. Artemis is the daughter of Zeus. Apollo is the son of Zeus. So it's no coincidence that in this city where the letter is addressed, that we get this very clear reference. And to the angel of the church of Thyatira write, these are the words of the Son of God. This, as far as I know, this term is not used in Revelation except for right here. Why is it used here? He wants to make it clear who the Son of God really is. The Son of God is Jesus, right? Son of God is not Apollo. And so he is going to, use that as a springboard to go into his letter. So I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions or comments, because we only have a couple minutes. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, Dwight has to go to the door.
Oh, I see. I thought somebody wanted to make a comment. So
No.
Any, if not, I will leave it there, and we will pick up with Thyatira in next week. We're still looking at these letters, but remember, the same structure, the same problems, really. Accommodation, don't accommodate. We're going to see, and one of the things I want to emphasize, one of the things I really wanted to get to today that I'll talk about next time, when we get to the Church of Philadelphia, some of these references that are being made to Isaiah, very, very Jewish, and were drawn upon by rabbis to explain and to illuminate the coming Messianic age. Well, John is doing it, and he's writing to these churches, making references and nuances in his letter that you would only know if you were Jewish. If you were a good law-abiding Jew, you would have heard this read in the synagogues. It must have been completely baffling to Gentiles who were in these churches. They would not have known the play on words that John is using. So they would have to have it explained to them. Anyway, we will meet next week. Does anybody want to have the last comment?
Thank you, Dan.
Well, that's a nice comment. Thank you, Jane. And I hope I'm not over speaking, talking too much, talking too fast. I'm very, very accommodating of criticisms or suggestions. So please let me know if there's something you would like to change about how we're going about this. Book of Revelation is a long book. I don't know if we're going to be through with it at the end of the year or not. We'll have to see. But I hope you don't mind us being really, really digging deep, or as deeply as we can. So if not, yeah, I will bid you all adieu, and I will see you next week. And the forum on Sunday is going to be on Matthew. So if you'd like to join then, look for that that link, that Zoom link that Damon has available. Okay, everyone, I'm going to stop sharing.
Bye.
Hey, thank you, Dan.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you next week.
Yep, bye.